Welcome to this course about food and wine pairing. I'm Dr. Rebecca Lawrence, a wine education specialist living and working in Italy. I help run the Vinitaly International Academy Educator Program. I teach for WSET, and interestingly, I have a background not originally in wine. Most people who talk about food and wine pairing come at it from the wine perspective, but I actually spent 7 years in London working with Michelin chefs, advising them on produce. And that's when I really realized that the great thing about food is the wine that goes with it. So why this course? Whilst I've been teaching, the thing that comes up most often in my classes is that students are really scared about food and wine. They're really uncertain. So I wanted to make this course to demystify food and wine pairing, to give you the knowledge, the skills that you really need to make successful pairings. So this course will look at how we taste, what interactions are happening when you put food and wine together. But the first thing to bear in mind when we start talking about taste is that actually smell, so the smell of this fantastic cake, is 80% of what we taste. This is really interesting and also quite important because when you smell something, you activate the saliva in your mouth. And it's the saliva in your mouth that helps break down molecules in food so that you can taste things. So what do we mean when we're talking about taste? Well, actually, we're talking about 5 different things. Okay? Sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and then this savory character that we've come to know as umami. We used to believe that you tasted these things at different points on the tongue, but actually that's been debunked, and you actually taste all of them all over the surface of your tongue, but the sides are a little bit more sensitive. Now let's take a bit of a deeper dive into these 5 things, starting with sweet. Okay? So sweetness is the literal sugar content in the food that you taste. And this has historically been a positive for us because sugar meant nutrients, which meant fuel. The same is found in salty things. So salty things were things that were like meat or proteins that are rich in nutrients. So again, we have this association with a positive taste. Sour and bitter, on the other hand, we have a much more complex relationship with because these are things that could be poisonous. They could be rancid. You know that the smell of milk when it's bad is terrible, and the same with the taste. But also, a lot of the things that we get bitter characters or these umami sour characters from are also rich in proteins. So this is a little bit complicated. And then umami. This is the savory character, this kind of protein. And again, incredibly positive, comes from high nutrient foods, for example, meats and high calorie cheeses. What about heat? We often talk about the taste of something hot, like chilies, chili sauces. But actually, heat is not a taste, it's a sensation. It's your taste buds reacting to the pain of interacting with chilies. But whilst it's not a taste, we are going to come back to this later in the course. So before we move on, I wanted to mention that the average adult has somewhere close to 10,000 taste buds on their tongue. Some of us have more, and some of us have less. And this accounts for the sensitivity levels in different people. We're going to think about what we need to consider in wine so that we can think about what is happening with the interaction between food and wine. Now, if you want to taste along with me, pause the video and go ahead and pour yourself maybe a small glass of white wine, such as a Pinot Grigio, and a small glass of red wine, such as a Chianti or a young Cabernet. So what we think about when we are considering wine in terms of food and wine interaction are the structural components. So this is not how it smells or tastes. We'll look at that later, but what we really want to think about is what is happening in the wine. Okay? So we talk about these structural components. And first, let's consider the hard structural elements of a wine. So this would be the acid or the tannin. Go ahead and taste your white wine if you have it, and think about what is happening in your mouth. It will help if you get the wine all over your mouth, but probably immediately you'll be able to see that your mouth is watering. And this mouth watering is caused by the high acid in this wine. Okay? So if you have a lot of saliva in your mouth, it's high acid. If there's virtually no saliva, it'll be low acid. And if it just feels natural, that'll be a medium acid wine. The other hard element is tannin. And this we normally talk about in relation to red wines. So do the same with your red wine, and this time try and get it all over your mouth and particularly on your gums. So you'll still get some of that watering because red wines have acid in them too, but you'll also feel this drying along your gums. And this is the impact of tannin in wines. Makes your mouth feel dry. And the more dry your mouth, the higher the tannins. What about the other elements? We also have these softer elements in wine. Okay? These are the sugar and the body. And when we talk about sugar, we are literally talking about the amount of sugar that is left in the wine after it's been made. Now, most people are drinking dry or off-dry wines, as we call them, so you're not going to notice the sugar. But obviously in some wines, like port or dessert wines, they have very high sugar content. And this will present itself as an obvious sweetness and a thick texture in your mouth. The other thing you need to think about is the body of the wine. And this is how it feels in your mouth. Okay? We talk about this as the weight of the wine. And I like to use a really interesting analogy when I'm teaching my classes because this can be very difficult to understand. Okay? So think about the wine in terms of whether it tastes and feels like water or maybe like lemon juice. Okay? This would be a light-bodied wine. If the wine feels like orange juice or maybe like milk, so it has a little bit of thickness, a bit of weight, this would be your medium-bodied wine. But if you put that wine in your mouth and it feels like cream, maybe it feels like mango juice, then this is a full-bodied wine. And it's really helpful to think of those comparisons when you're thinking about the body of wine. So as well as these hard, the acid and tannin structural components of wine, and the soft, the sweetness and body of wine, we also need to consider the alcohol. Now, obviously all wine has alcohol in it, but the amount of alcohol can be quite important when thinking about food pairings. So how do you tell? Basically, when you taste alcohol in your mouth, it presents itself as a warmth in the back of your throat or maybe a heat in your mouth. So the more alcohol, the more warmth, the more heat you will feel in your mouth. So these are the structural elements of wine that we need to consider with food and wine pairing. What I wanted to do in this video was help isolate those 5 tastes we talk about in food so that you can learn to highlight the dominant flavor or flavor in dishes, which will really help you with your food and wine pairing. So let's do it in the order. So salt, salty foods. Some of these are obvious. So salted French fries, things with lots of soy sauce, soups, things that use a lot of stock. But sometimes it's not so obvious because salt is added to food to enhance the flavor. So one thing to consider is perhaps your favorite dish makes you feel very thirsty. This might be an indication that it has a high salt content and that this is something you could think about. So sour. Well, obviously things like lemon and citrus is sour. You can think about it the first time you put a lemon in your mouth and you got that really sharp flavor. But there are other things that are acidic, sour, when you don't really know that they are. For example, tomatoes are incredibly acidic. For anyone who cooks a lot, if you are cutting tomatoes with your knives, you know that your knives go blunt very quickly. This is because of the acid content. What about bitter foods? Sometimes this can be equally difficult. Green vegetables, so things like kale and broccoli are inherently bitter. But a good way to tell if a food has a high level of bitterness is to think about whether they make your mouth dry. So if you think about in the last video, we were talking about tannins making your mouth dry, then this is similar to what you get with highly bitter foods. So umami or savory foods. If you're watching from the UK or from Australia, you will know that Vegemite or Marmite is the epitome of the umami flavor. This is the incredibly savory taste that you get from things like truffles, from grilled meat, from things like miso soup. What about sweetness? Well, we all know that dessert, cakes, chocolate, those kinds of things are sweet. But it's interesting to consider that many vegetables have an inherent sweetness. Think about carrots, about pumpkin, about sweet potatoes. I mean, the clue is in the name. So if you have lots of these in a dish, perhaps one of the things that you're going to need to consider when thinking about your wine is potentially a level of sweetness in the dish. Now, when you're thinking about how to really tease this out of the dish that you're tasting, you want to think about what the main part of the dish is and start there. And sometimes it's very obvious. So if you're eating a piece of grilled meat, for example, maybe umami is the most obvious flavor. But with fish, this is generally something a little bit more neutral, so maybe you need to consider the sauce that goes with it. Are you serving grilled fish with a lemon sauce or a cream sauce, and take that into consideration? For example, if you're tasting a salad, is the main component something bitter, like a bitter arugula, a rocket, or a kale, a brassica, or is it actually the dressing that you need to focus on? And remember, there are not always just one thing to think about, so maybe focus on the first thing and then tease out from there. And to help you with this, the current slide that's on the screen shows you some classic dishes and has highlighted in them what might be the main consideration. This kind of shows you what you should be considering, what you should be thinking about when you're making those food and wine pairings. So now we know what we need to look for in the dish. Yeah? This sweet, sour, salty, savory, or bitter taste, or maybe a combination. And we also know what we're thinking about in the wine: the acid, the tannin, the sweetness, the body, and the alcohol. I want to explore what actually happens when these two things coincide. So as you can see from the chart, these are roughly referred to as food friends and food enemies. Food friends, these things in green, okay, so salt and acid typically, have a positive impact on what you're tasting and or drinking. So sweet and bitter, umami, have a negative impact potentially. Okay. So food friends, so salt and acid, tend to make wine less drying, less bitter, and they increase the fruit and body. You also see a reduction in acidity, whereas these food enemies, the sweetness, bitterness, umami, can make wines more drying, more bitter, less sweet, and less fruity, so potentially negative. Now, one way to really see how this happens is to try a little exercise. And I'm going to do it now, and you can try this at home. So remember, we've got our high acid wine, the Pinot Grigio, and the high tannin wine, the Chianti or the Cabernet. So let's look at the interaction between something that is a food friend, acidity, with the high acid wine. So take a sip of your wine to reacquaint yourself. Remember that high acid. Take a bite of lemon. And then taste your wine again. What you will notice is that you have less of that obvious acidity. The acidity seems diminished in the wine. So let's do this exercise with the red wine with the salt that I have here and see what happens to the tannins. Same thing. Remember that incredible dryness that you get on your gums? Take a little bit of salt, maybe some salted nuts, put it in your mouth, try the wine again. So now, instead of that really drying, harsh tannin, the wine feels much softer. The lovely raspberry, strawberry notes are coming through. And this is something that you can try at home to really see how these interactions work. Alcohol is something that we talked about in our previous session, about this heat that it creates in your mouth. And what I wanted to talk about was the interaction this has with chili flavor. Because alcohol not only gives you a heat in your mouth, it opens your pores. So this gives a greater surface area for those pain receptors for chili. So high alcohol wines with high chili foods will make this incredible burn in your mouth. I want to kind of broaden the scope, give you some broad strokes that you can think about beyond these structural components that might help you with your pairings. Okay? Things that you want to consider above and beyond these structural components, the more romantic side of food and wine pairing. So the first and most obvious thing we need to consider are the flavors and aromas of the dish and also the wine. So for example, if you have a lovely, light, fresh, citrusy dish, then you probably don't want to pair it with a really nutty, strongly oaked, powerful wine. If you have a richly textured stew that has got these deep umami flavors, this really rich braising, then you probably don't want a light wine that tastes of fresh strawberries. So that's the first thing. Then we want to combine this with the intensity of the wine. If you have an incredibly intensely aromatic dish, then this could overpower a light wine. And equally, if you have an incredibly powerful wine but a very light, fresh dish, then this could have the same effect. So you might want to consider pairing an aromatic, intense dish with a generally aromatic wine to a degree of intensity. So maybe you want to think about using a Sauvignon Blanc or a Riesling in this case to enhance the intensity of both. And from this we can move on to the idea of what you want your pairing to achieve, because this is equally important. Do you want a pairing that complements the dish? So for example, if you have a chicken in a rich, creamy, buttery sauce, do you want a rich, creamy, buttery wine to go with it? Or do you want a contrast? Do you actually want something that's going to cut through the fat of that dish and provide relief from it? And don't dismiss texture when you're thinking about wine, because it's such an important part of food, but it's also a really important part of wine. So if you have a rich, oily dish, maybe you want an oily wine like a Greco or a Riesling to go with it. You want to complement the two of them. Again, we're thinking about this complementing and contrasting, but also in relation to texture, as well as aromas and intensity. Finally, and I can't stress this enough, the most important consideration is whether or not you're going to like it. There's no point in pairing a dish with a Riesling if you don't like Riesling. And think about this thing I was talking about with alcohol and chili burn. Okay? Some people actually really like that their dish has that little bit more heat, that little bit more fire when they power it with a more alcoholic wine. So don't discard the importance of your taste when you're doing food and wine pairing. So hopefully this course has given you some insight into the interactions that are happening between elements of food and elements of wine and the impact they can have on your food pairing. But the thing I really want to leave you with, this idea not to be ruled by rules. Okay? Don't think about things in terms of food friends or food enemies. It really is only your judgment that can tell you whether a pairing is good or bad, because it's whether you enjoy it or not. In many of my classes, I get asked for classic pairings, but I think many people know these already. We talk about champagne and oysters, red wine and steak, and so I wanted to make this a little bit more personal and talk about some of my favorite pairings. Okay? So I like to enjoy fried chicken with a great chilled bottle of Franciacorta, because fried chicken and bubbles, you can't go wrong. I love pizza and Lambrusco, but also I really like fish with chilled red wine. I eat a lot of fish with roasted vegetables or with tomatoes, and therefore a chilled red wine is much more suitable, in my opinion, than a white wine. And also, don't save your wine pairings for big occasions. Okay, it doesn't have to be the most special dinner. Maybe you're having a movie night and you're just having popcorn. Try choosing the best wine to go with your popcorn. And if in doubt, just give it a try. What can go wrong? So what I want you to do is take either your favorite local restaurant menu or design a menu that you might make at home and choose a selection of wine to go with those dishes. Okay? I want you to think about what elements are at play and make justifications for your choices. Remember, it's not whether I agree with your choices or not at all. It's more about seeing whether you can put into practice the things that we've talked about and make choices that make sense that you're going to enjoy. So think about what the tastes are in your dishes, what the structural elements of your wine are. Think about flavors, intensity, texture, and give a choice for each different wine that you've chosen. Hopefully, this is a chance for you to have fun, put your skills into practice, and most importantly, gain confidence with your food and wine pairing. I'm Dr. Rebecca Lawrence, and I'm here with Mama Jumbo Shrimp. We're a team of wine professionals aimed at making big wine concepts into small packages.